planting in summer for a fall garden is different than planting in spring for a summer garden. Hi, I'm GardenerScott, a master gardener who discusses everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. Today, I'll show you how I plant my fall garden. The key differences between starting your seeds and plants in the spring to grow into the summer versus starting your seeds and plants in the summer to grow into the fall generally come down to soil and weather. When you start in the spring, the soil is generally cool, but the bed is ready to go. You have it amended and the plants will do well as soon as they start growing. And then as the days get longer and warmer, the plants begin to grow stronger until they get into the summer. And under the heat of the sun, a lot of those plants begin to slow down and get stressed just as you get to the point of harvest. But when you start in the summer, you kind of have to turn all that upside down because the beds may be depleted. You've had plants growing in them. So you have to think about amending them before you put the seeds and the plants in. And the sun, being at its peak, is now putting all of the stress on those very young seedlings. So you have to anticipate that so that they can begin growing. As the days get shorter and cooler, a lot of the plants that you choose to grow into the fall are getting into their prime. Those are ideal conditions. So now as you get to harvest, those plants aren't stressed. Instead, they're really growing at their peak. This was my garlic bed, and just about a year ago, I got it filled, the soil amended, and then about 9 months ago is when I actually put the garlic in place. Well, I haven't done anything with the soil since that time because I didn't want to disturb the garlic. So it's had no amendments in almost a year. The garlic has definitely sucked up some of the nutrients that was in the soil. A lot of the organic material was decomposed and the bed has begun to sink a little bit. So before I put any seeds or plants in for a fall harvest, I need to think about the soil. So I'm going to amend it now. And the very first step is to remove a lot of the mulch that I had in place for the garlic. So all I'm doing is trying to remove as much of the mulch that was on the surface as I can. One of the reasons I like using straw and grass and dried leaves as a mulch on my vegetable garden beds is because of this time of year when I'm going to redo my beds for a fall crop. If some of this straw works its way into the soil, it's no big deal. This is good organic material. But I don't want too much because as this decomposes in the soil, it could lead to a nitrogen depletion problem because it takes nitrogen for this material to decompose. A lot of material means a lot more nitrogen. So if I can remove as much of it as possible, there's still that nitrogen issue, but it's not so bad. And I'm anticipating it, so the next step will actually be to add some fertilizer that has a good amount of nitrogen. I'm using Osmocote as my fertilizer of choice. It's a 15-9-12 fertilizer, and it recommends 1 scoop for each 4 square feet. And I have 32 square feet here. So I'm going to be using 8 scoops of the Osmocote, trying to spread it fairly evenly over the surface. It'll be 4 scoops per side. I've added 3 cubic feet of mushroom compost to the surface. That's about 40 liters. And I'm just going to spread it out so that it evenly covers the surface of the bed. That'll be about 2 to 3 inches of coverage on top of the soil. Let's talk for a little bit about no-dig gardening. Charles Dowding has a great method where you just keep adding organic material to the top of the soil and there's no digging involved. And so if you have good, rich soil, you could stop at this point. The compost on the top with additional mulch that we'll add a little later is really all that you need. But this bed is only a year old. It's only been amended once when I first built the bed. It's been sitting for almost a year with the sun, the rain, the snow working to compact the soil. So it's pretty dense. I want to loosen it up. So for me, I don't have a loose, rich soil in this bed yet. I'm going to have to now incorporate this fertilizer and organic material into the soil. I'm going to have to dig. So I'm going to dig down, turn it upside down to help get all of this material incorporated. If you have a good, loose, rich soil, just stop at this point for planting. But if you have compaction issues like I do, or very poor soil, consider turning this in and amending the soil. I know I have earthworms in this bed, so to reduce potential damage to the worms, like this one right here, I'm using a garden fork. This tends to keep the soil a little bit looser, and unlike a spade, I really don't run the risk of slicing the earthworms in half. I added a cubic foot of aged manure. That's about 28 liters to the top to fill in some of the crevices and to put some organic material closer to the surface. And then I'll just level out this bed to get ready for my sowing. I prefer to sow seeds in a moist soil, and this bed is mostly moist, but some of the material that I just added was dry. So I'm going to go ahead and give the bed a really good soaking before I put any seeds or plants in it. This will help some of those earthworms that were upset a little bit by turning over the bed. It'll also help to settle the soil a little bit because it's very loose at this point. And it does ensure that when I put the seeds in, the moist soil will surround those seeds, which will really help with germination. While I'm waiting for the soil to settle, I'm going to turn my focus to my square foot garden bed. Now, you don't have to think in terms of getting entire beds ready to go for the summer sowing. You can deal with just very small spaces as they become available, like in this square foot garden bed. I've got a few squares that are empty, so now it's time to start thinking about putting some new seeds in. And the process is just the same, but on a smaller scale. I'm going to move the mulch to the side, open up the soil where I'm going to plant, and then I'll add some fertilizer and work it into the soil. Now, I'm not going to be adding a lot of organic material at this point, but I am going to use this tool, the one that you've probably always wondered what to do with. This cultivator is just a tool that's meant to turn over the top few inches of the soil. The tines are only a few inches long. So I'm going to take my fertilizer, spread it over the soil, and then using the cultivator, just work it in. And so by putting the cultivator into the soil and just moving it back and forth, you're able to loosen up those top few inches. And after adding fertilizer, that fertilizer is now incorporated into the top few inches, which is exactly what I want to help improve the soil at this point. I'm sowing spinach in these open squares. Spinach over here I'm letting go to seed, so I need more spinach to harvest. This particular variety, Bloomsdale Long Standing, will take about 48 days to harvest after the seedlings emerge from the ground, which is ideal for starting in the summer and growing into the fall. It'll give me lots of time for these plants to grow and then reach harvest before my first frost comes. And spinach is strong enough to actually withstand that first frost. So I'm anticipating harvesting this spinach for many months to come. I spread the seeds about 6 inches apart on the surface, and then I'll just push them into the soil about 1/2 inch deep. And lightly cover those little holes I made, the little impressions, smooth out the soil, and then I'm going to add this straw back on top of this area. Very lightly, very loose, but I do want to cover the soil. And this is a difference between the summer sowing and the spring sowing. Typically in the spring, we start our seeds and we leave the soil open to the sun because we want that soil to stay warm. But in the summer, we really don't want that soil exposed to the sun because it's going to dry out so quickly. And as soon as those seedlings emerge, that harsh sun is going to start baking them. So by covering with a very light layer of mulch, not only are we helping to keep the soil a little cooler, but we're giving those seedlings a little bit extra protection once they break the surface. And you really don't need to worry about whether those plants can push through a mulch like that straw, because the plants are used to pushing through some pretty dense soil. So a very light layer of mulch really poses no problem whatsoever. I used the same method as in the square foot garden bed in this bed. I had an open space after harvest. So between the squash and the cucumbers, I put a whole bunch of Napa cabbage in this space. I pulled apart the mulch, put in the seeds, covered them up, and then added some more mulch on top. And I've kept this bed well watered so that these very small cabbage seeds will begin to germinate. You can see how strong the plants are by looking at these dill seedlings. I put seed under this wood chip mulch a couple weeks ago, and the dill just pushed right through it. I have a few other videos in this fall garden series that will give you a good idea of what kind of plants you can choose to harvest in the fall, and I'll be sure and put links at the end of this video. One thing to consider as you're putting your seeds and plants in the bed is their size at maturity. Now, it's not as big an issue when you start in the spring because you put your seeds in, they grow, and in summer the sun is going to be directly overhead and all the plants will get plenty of sun. But when you start in the summer and grow into the fall, well, the sun is gradually going to be lower in the sky. So in the northern hemisphere, I want my tallest plants to be on the north end and the shorter plants to be on the south end. That way, I won't have to worry about taller plants shading the smaller plants as the sun gets lower in the sky. I want to make sure all the plants get as much sun as possible. For the seeds that I've chosen for this bed, I'm using 3 different methods to put the seeds in place. For the pak choi, I dug a little trench that's about 1/4 inch deep, and then I spread the seeds in that trench. And then covered up the seeds. This will give me a pretty good line of the pak choi. For the lettuce, I'm really not that concerned about having straight rows. So I take the little seed and just broadcast it all across the surface. And these seeds only need to be about 1/8 of an inch deep. So I just rough up the soil to cover the seeds lightly with soil. And then for the bigger seeds, like the radish, again, to get a nice straight line, I'll place the seeds on the surface, and then I'll push them in to the appropriate depth. For these radishes, it's about 1/2 inch. And then I cover up the holes with the soil. With all the seeds in place, now I just take the mulch that I removed from before and spread it lightly across the surface. If I didn't have old straw like this, I'd use new straw or dried grass. And then I want to water the entire bed very well. This will help the straw settle in. It'll make sure the soil is moistened, which improves germination. And then I'm also going to add another step. I'm going to take some burlap and set it in the middle of the bed. The more burlap you have, the better, but the idea is that you cover the surface with the burlap, and then I'll wet the burlap. The wet burlap and the wet straw will really work together to keep this bed from drying out, which is the last thing I want in the middle of the summer, but it's one of the most likely things to happen. To hold the burlap in place and not fly away in the wind, I use these garden staples or landscape pins and just push them in on the edge to hold the burlap in place. Now the burlap is only here for a few days. It's just to make sure that the soil doesn't dry out during the critical period when the seedling begins to grow. I will check underneath it because these seeds will germinate pretty quickly, but I'm guessing it's only going to be 4 or 5 days before I remove the burlap. It's just a temporary aid to keep the soil moist. I'm also placing hoops over this bed. I'm using my cattle panel hoops for a few different reasons. To further reduce the chance that the sun will dry out the soil, it's nice to put another layer of shading. You could use shade cloth over the hoops at this point. I have this AgFabric Row cover. It lightly shades the soil, and in addition to the burlap, does a pretty good job of keeping it a little cool inside, reducing the evaporation, and giving the seedlings a fighting chance. In a few days, I'll remove the burlap, but I'll still leave this in place because of another reason to have the hoops and to have a row cover. It's to keep insects away from the plants. As we move into the fall, there will be fewer insects, but now, at the height of summer, there's some big adult bugs looking for a meal of tasty young seedlings. So this row cover is held in place with these spring clamps, and it'll help keep a lot of those insects away from these young plants. And as we move further into the fall and get closer to our first frost date, I'll take this off and I'll replace it with plastic. And so by covering the hoops with plastic, I'll be able to increase the temperature underneath the hoop to give the seedlings even a better chance as we get closer to the cold nights. I'll go ahead and put links to some of the materials that I've used in today's video in the description below. My fall garden is started, but I still have a lot more harvests to go. And as I harvest a lot of these summer crops, I'll be filling the space with more fall crops and continuing the process as we get closer to that first frost date. To learn more about the first frost date and fall gardens, click on one of these videos to keep you on your journey and make you a better gardener. I'm GardenerScott. Enjoy gardening.